Hey, we do this every week where we take an opportunity to look into Jesus' life a little bit and share some of our stories as well. And you may have been noticing in the past few weeks, we've been bringing in more stories from the North City community, and I love that, to hear other people's stories. I thought I would start, speaking of my mom, she just texted me, a story from her life, our lives, and this was back in the ancient time of the 90s. The time of easy bake ovens and a mysterious band called In Sync a long time ago. Got some nose laughs from the 90s babies. There was one afternoon my parents got this call, and it was a lawyer on the other line. And normally when you get calls from lawyers, you're a little bit like, what did I do wrong? But the lawyer said, hey, we would love for you to come to a reading of a will of Edna Ryan. And immediately they recognized that name because that was their next door neighbor. And I grew up most of the beginning of my life in a small town called Red Wing, Minnesota, south of here. And we lived next to a somewhat reclusive elderly lady who sometimes we'd see in the window watching us play in our yard next to us. And my parents were real sweet and shoveled driveways and connected with her when they could. But they were kind of a little confused because they didn't quite have a relationship with her that would merit being a part of getting called by a lawyer and coming into the reading of a will. So they went sort of with some trepidation, and they're like, what is going on here? And they were sitting with these other family members, and then all of a sudden they heard their children's names being read from this woman's will, one of which was mine. And it turns out this woman had left me and my siblings $100,000 for education, had left us a $25,000 gift. And that gift totally shocked my parents, obviously. My dad was a pastor, my mom was an English teacher, and lived pretty humble lives, and they were kind of awestruck for a while. And Edna had given no evidence that this was going to happen, told them nothing about it, and it changed my life. It really provided opportunities for me as a young person in education, and I often reflect on that reality, that gift that just totally still my mind, to this day in my mind, just blows my mind. And you know, there's a lot to reflect on in that in my own life and how much it's changed, but one of the things that it's done is I asked often, why did she do that? Why did she do that? What was motivating her? And I can tell you upon reflection, she didn't do it for any credit. I mean, she's still not alive, so she's not garnering any praise, no attention for that gift towards us. And so I've often scratched my head why. The best we can tell is that she often would tell stories about watching us from the window playing, and not in a creepy way, like in a very loving way. There's Edna, wave. But she clearly developed a love and care for us, and out of no selfish ambition, left us this very generous gift that has made a huge impact on my life. And I've often asked the question, what motivates me? Why do I do things? And part of this Jesus story space that we're in, where we're telling stories from our community, we're asking what difference Jesus has made in our own lives recently. And one of the things I was reflecting on is that in the past year or two, with all the disruptions we've experienced, one of the things that's happened to me is the disruptions in my life have been an opportunity to assess my own motivations. Why do I do the things that I do? Particularly in my faith as well. Why do I practice doing things in certain ways? What am I truly being motivated by? And when I was reflecting on that, I thought of a scripture that talks precisely about that, motivations. It's a story from Jesus' life. Claudia actually last week told a story from a section in the Gospels, which are stories about Jesus, called the Sermon on the Mount. And this is a collection of Jesus' teaching where he's kind of like, this is the greatest hits, if you will, that he's giving on this mountaintop with this huge crowd of people. And there's this section where he talks about spiritual practices. And he talks about maybe unearthing the motivation behind our spiritual practices. And he's kind of calling out the spiritual practices of the day, and more specifically, some of the motivations behind the spiritual practices of the day. And as Kara said, it's this season of Lent where we often think about some new spiritual practices or something that connect us with Jesus. And this first line in the Passion Translation of this text really connected with me, given that I've been assessing some of my motivations. It simply says, examine your motivations. That's a translation of what Jesus says. I'm going to read a few verses, actually, from the Message translation, and I think this really resonates with some of the tension I've experienced in my faith recently. It says, be especially careful when you're trying to be good so that you don't make a performance out of it. It might be good theater, but God who made you won't be applauding. When you do something for someone else, don't call attention to yourself. You've seen them in action. I'm sure the play actors, and here Jesus is referencing a specific group of people, the Pharisees, and that word play actors that's being translated here is the word that's often translated hypocrite. Play actors, I call them, treating prayer meetings in street corners like a stage, acting compassionate as long as someone is watching, playing to the crowd. They get applause, true, but that's all they get. When you help someone out, don't think about how it looks. Just do it quietly and unobtrusively. That is the way your God, who conceived you in love, working behind the scenes, helps you out. And he talks about prayer. And when you come before God, don't turn into a theatrical production. All these people making a regular show out of their prayers, hoping for 15 minutes of fame. Do you think God sits in the box seats? Here's what I want you to do. Find a quiet, secluded space so you won't be tempted to role play before God. Just be there as simply and honestly as you can manage. The focus will shift from you to God, and you will begin to sense his grace. The world is full of so-called prayer warriors who who are prayer ignorant. They're full of formulas and programs and advice, peddling techniques for getting what you want from God. Don't fall into their nonsense. This is your Father you're dealing with, and he knows better than you do what you need. When with a God like this loving you, you can pray very simply. Then he gives what's known as the Lord's Prayer. I'm just going to skip down where it keeps talking about fasting, the season that some of us choose to do that in this season. When you practice some appetite-denying discipline to better concentrate on God, it's a good definition of fasting, don't make a production out of it. It might turn you into a small-time celebrity, but it won't make you a saint. If you go into training inwardly, act normally outwardly. Shampoo and comb your hair. That must have been a thing back then. I think we still do that when we fast. Brush your teeth, wash your face. Pretty standard things to do. Must have been a problem. God doesn't require attention-getting devices. He won't overlook what you are doing. He'll reward you well. And then he kind of gets to the point here. Do not hoard treasures down here where it gets eaten by moths and corroded by rust, or worse, stolen by burglars. Stockpile treasures in the heavenly realm, where it's safe from moth and rust and burglars. Isn't it? It's obvious, isn't it? The place where your treasure is the place where you most want to be and end up being. Other translations translate that last verse, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. So if I started this text from Jesus with the first words and the last words, it would sound something like this. It would sound like, examine your motives, because what motivates you, what you treasure, shapes your life, it shapes you, it shapes how you live, and it shapes who you're becoming. And I think that's an amazing way to put into words. Jesus is great at words, isn't he? It's an amazing way to put into words some of the tension I've experienced in my own heart with some of the disruptions I've experienced. I've been asking myself some questions, some tough questions, like, do I judge my spiritual health based on what I do for God or how I'm enjoying being with God? Are the motives of my life and heart fueled by a need to be seen, or some hurt or insecurity that I'm still harboring, some woundedness or pride that is calling out for attention? When I love my neighbors, do I do it because I want to be recognized or because I'm truly enjoying participating with God and loving them? When I post something on Facebook, am I wanting to be perceived as knowledgeable or understanding of a certain issue instead of truly caring for maybe the issue that I'm posting about? Do I engage in spiritual practices in public or in private because I ultimately am motivated to enjoy God and people, or because of some self-interest? Now, I don't tell this story to make you feel bad about yourself. I don't think Jesus's motivation is to do that either. Maybe you're like, I don't feel bad about myself. Clearly you feel bad about yourself, JD. That's fine too. I just love to be honest, and I think there's this invitation that Jesus always carries of this loving presence in my life, someone who clearly cares about me, but cares about me enough to help me assess what's motivating me, what's driving my life. And often when I've reflected on those questions, I'm convicted by the answers. I grew up in a church context. I grew up, as I mentioned earlier, a pastor's kid, and there's an inherent thing that happens where you learn to get affirmation from Christian activities. There's also something I realized, that I've been around the church long enough to be hurt by people who are pursuing Christian things for ulterior motives. And so I live sometimes with the hurt of those experiences as well. And I'm left, maybe as listeners were of Jesus that day, wondering, well, what do we do about this? How do we address this? And often when I've thought about that, I've thought about Edna's gift in a lot of ways. And I thought about her in a non-creepy way, watching us across the yard. And I think about the love that probably just welled up in her heart that motivated her to do that thing. And when I think about examining my motivations, I want something like what she probably experienced in that moment. I want my motivations to come from that place rather than come from some insecurity of wanting some attention or some place of hurt in my past. So how do we, I've been thinking about this, how do we detox our motivations? How do we go through a motivation detox? And like Jesus so often does, he challenges us and also shows us a different way in some of what he says. And did you pick up on the do stuff in secret? This sort of way of doing things without recognition? So it's the Lenten season, and instead of giving you applications that you maybe think about, I want to invite you into a fun adventure. Will you roll with me for a little bit? I thought about playing like Mission Impossible music behind myself right now, but I didn't go to that length. But I need some helpers. Would there be anybody who would be willing to help me pass out these sheets of paper? Joseph, sweet man. Could you give a half a stack to Joseph? And for those of you who are new, we don't normally do this. I don't normally invite people to adventures. Usually we set up a time of a listening time around our tables, but I just felt compelled to do something a little bit different and invite you into maybe a different sort of practice in this season. And if you're like, hey, these things aren't for me, cool, just read the piece of paper. No pressure to do this whatsoever. My desire is not to create more homework for you to feel bad about not doing. That's not what I'm doing. Here's the secret mission. Oh my goodness, I gave one out and I didn't keep one for myself. I should probably, it's a classic thing. No, I got it. Rookie mistake. So here's the top secret mission to love our neighbors before Easter, I would say. And this is, another way to say it is a spiritual detox, to not gain credit for anything. And in a way, this kind of cleanses our motivations, if you will, by doing it just for the pure enjoyment of doing it with God and for others. The steps are pretty simple. Listen to God's prompting for a way to love your neighbors in some way over the next month and a half or so. So simply just like in the next few moments here, I'll lead you in a time of quiet where you can just try to listen. And if that's new for you, listening to God, you're like, JD, that makes me very uncomfortable. That's okay. You can try or not try, whatever your level of comfortability with. But I think there's a real joy in listening for some creativity of God's presence in our life to prompt us to step 2, just try something. There's no hurt in just trying something. And please don't feel like you have to give inheritance to your neighbors as something God is going to say. That's obviously a huge thing. Only if it's Kara. Yeah, only if you live next to Kara. But it can be the smallest thing. It's not about what it is. It's about the joy of receiving an invitation to participate with God and loving someone else. And then tell no one. Here's the detox part of the motivations. Tell no one, just to assess how that feels. Unless that person, like a spouse or a friend, is your accomplice in the secret mission and you need their help. So I've just got a couple sparks for you here. This comes from, as I was thinking about the season of fasting, this comes from this passage that probably informed what Jesus was saying here in Isaiah 58, where God, through a prophet, said, it's not, this is the kind of fasting I have chosen, which is really interesting. He says, to loose the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, to break every yoke of slavery, to share food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, and when you see the naked, to clothe them. Does that sound familiar? As a part of the Gospels, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. That means that aunt and uncle that is weird at the family gatherings, by the way. To turn away from your own flesh and blood, then your light will break forth in the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. That's a pretty unique list of what fasting looks like, right? That's a pretty unique list of spiritual practices. So that has sort of inspired these just general categories. And this is not a to-do list. This is just to spark your imagination. So here's what we're going to do. For the next minute or two, we're going to just have some relative silence. It's hard to hold silence in a space like this, but relative silence, and we're just going to practice. Maybe what you can do is just close your eyes and listen for God's voice, or if it's helpful to just read through this list and see if anything stands out for you or maybe sparks another idea for you. Write that down, put it in your calendar or something, and then here's a secret mission. This church is not going to come looking for those stories to share them. I'm not going to come ask you how it's going. This is strictly just you and God enjoying blessing other people. This is a detox of motivations. And so let's just enjoy that. It's not going to be Easter time and be like, how'd that go for you? It's just simply going to be a fun adventure that you and God can enjoy. So let me pray and welcome us into this time. We're going to give about 3 or 4 minutes of silence, and then I'll transition us to some discussion around our tables that we call listening time. And in that time, I'm just going to invite you to share maybe one thing that stood out to you from the Jesus story, or maybe a story from your own life where someone blessed you unexpectedly. So let me pray, welcome us into this space. If this is uncomfortable for you, just hang with us for a few minutes. It'll only last for a few minutes, and then we'll keep going. Jesus, thank you so much that you love us enough to challenge us and to invite us into assessing our motives. And God, I just want to acknowledge that is an invitation to be with you, ultimately. To be seen by you, to be loved by you. So help us to receive this invitation to participate with you. And God, I pray that you would spark our imagination and invite us into some really fun things, and maybe even reorient some of our motives in the midst of it. In Jesus' name, amen.